Good. That being said, so we know now what all these entries in my life table that I started with, what they mean. Yeah? And the reflection that I want to add at this point is not covered in the book, but I think it's good for your understanding to keep in mind a little bit how these life tables, these period life tables, which represent the mortality experience as observed during a particular year, during a particular calendar year, how these life tables connect to each other if you take the mortality data from different years altogether. And an important concept there to mention is the difference between a period life table and a cohort life table. And that's very important if you look at publications, for instance, by the Centraal Bureau voor Statistiek in the Netherlands, or publications on mortality data by the Royal Dutch Association of Actuaries, then this difference between period and cohort will often be emphasized. So let's take a moment to think about that. So if you talk about a period life table, you look at the statistical evidence, a frequency of death as observed for various ages, but during one particular time period. And typically that's 1 year, but you could also look at averages over 5 years or 10 years, whatever, right? So the crucial point is here that you look at a given period of time. So what are the drawbacks then? That several generations get mixed in such a period life table. So if you calculate a demographic indicator, for instance, a life expectancy or something, based on this period life table, then that doesn't fit for one particular generation, but it mixes the information from various generations. And what do I mean with that? So let's say I'm 39 years old in the year 2020. So if I want to calculate my expected future lifetime, and if I would be using the data from last year, for instance, then I need to use the P39, the P40, P41, P42, etc., which I can then use from the period life table from last year. But somebody who is, let's say, 75 years old in the year 2019, somebody who is 85 years old in the year 2019, this is somebody who does not belong to my cohort or to my generation, right? So if I use the period approach, if I use the mortality rates from the year 2019 to do a calculation for me, then I'm relying on information from generations, cohorts, which do not match with the, let's say, the expectations that we have in terms of the mortality of, for example, my specific generation, right? So I think it will become more clear if we make the contrast between this period approach and the so-called cohort approach. So if we apply a different kind of thinking, and if we look at cohort or dynamic life tables, what we're then going to do is that we're going to follow a cohort or a generation over time. So that means I'm 39 in the year 2020, I will be 40 in the year 2021, 41 in the year 2022, and so on. So when I let my age move, I will also let the year move together with the age. So if you look at cohort life tables, we're going to study 2 entries, so not only age, but also calendar year T, right? And we're going to work not just with the QX, but we're going to work with the QXT. So we're going to refer to the mortality for an X-year-old in year T. So for me, that would be for a 39-year-old in the year 2020, okay? And what is interesting then, if I want to do calculations with this cohort thinking, then I will quickly need to come up with projections of these mortality rates for future T, right? Because if I want to do a calculation for my own life expectancy, for instance, then I would need the Q40 in 2021, the Q41 in 2022, and so on. So I need to come up with realistic scenarios for what these Qs will be in the future. And that's where the econometric model building, the econometric thinking comes into place. So this is a widely studied topic in demography, in actuarial science and beyond. So how to build stochastic models to project these mortality rates into the future, and how to use these scenarios to do, for instance, valuation of pension liabilities, etc. Yeah. So here you see a visual. So what I mean with a period life table is that you look at the available data by putting the ages here, one age per row. And what I will do here is 1 year per column, right? And if I use a period life table approach, then I would do my calculations using the Qs for one particular year. So for instance, here for the year T-1. But if I apply a cohort or a diagonal way of thinking, then I'm going to do my calculations like this. So I'm really going to follow a cohort over time. So I start with a 0-year-old in the year T-1, for example. He will become a 1-year-old in the year T, a 2-year-old in the year T+1, etc. And I'm going to work with this type of thinking, right? And as soon as I hit, let's say, the boundary of my table, as soon as I reach the most recent year of data available, then I will have to make projections to the future in order to be able to apply this, this type of diagonal calculations. So whenever you read something in the newspaper about a life expectancy in the Netherlands, for example, you have to ask yourself, yeah, is this a period type of calculation or is this a cohort type of calculation? So to give you a first glimpse at how we can visualize such data, here are a few examples that I prepared and on which you will further elaborate in the data camp course. So what you see here is for one particular year of data, 2013, I plot the logarithm of the QX against HX. So H is at the horizontal axis, and then on the vertical axis, I've got the logarithm of the mortality rate, right? So then it's very striking to see three phenomena being pictured in this graph. In blue, you see the infant mortality, right? So infant mortality, which is locally high around for newborns, but which then decreases drastically, right? Then in red, you see the so-called accident hump, which is most pronounced for the male data. So this is a local increase in the mortality rates because of, yeah, to frame it that way, because of the, let's say, the dangerous behavior or the more risky behavior, I should say, of young men around the age of 18, 20, which is very visual, which is very noticeable in the statistics with this local increase. And then, of course, you see the aging process where the QX increases when you become older, okay? So keep this picture in mind, because from time to time I ask during the exam to visualize certain concepts. And a typical one could be that I ask you to make a picture of the mortality rates as a function of age and to discuss a few properties or a few specific characteristics of this graph. I put it here at the logarithm scale. That's not a coincidence, and that's to make sure that these three features become very visible. If I would just plot QX against X, then the QX would be very, very low and would only start to increase, noticeably increase for old ages X. So it's a good idea to plot it here at the logarithm to make these phenomena clearly visible. And then to discuss a little bit the evolution over time, I prepared the following visual. So what you see here is that for different years of data, I downloaded the information from the human mortality database, and each gray line here in the graph represents 1 year of data for Belgium, for male data. And you see here clearly that our mortality rates decrease over time, right? And that's also what we refer to with this longevity phenomenon, that people tend to live longer due to improvements in healthcare in living conditions, and so on and so forth. So here you saw how we evolved from the data in 1950 to the data in 2050. So one of the jobs of actuaries working on modeling this evolution is then, by using this as input data, how can you calibrate an appropriate econometric model, and how can you use this model to project these mortality rates into the future, right? So here there's a lot of time series modeling, for example, that comes into play then.